Hi and welcome back to the online stakeholder engagement in systematic reviews methods course. We're going to kick off this session on defining stakeholders by giving you some time to think about how you define stakeholders. So think about your work and think about who your stakeholders are. How many do you work with and how are they different? Also spend some time thinking about how you would specifically define the term stakeholder. What does it mean to you? And if you don't use the term stakeholder, or even if you do, what other terms do you use to describe the people who you work with? What other groups do you engage with besides your main stakeholders? Who are they and how do you engage with them? So pause the video here and go to the discussion board. There, just write a brief paragraph about these questions above, particularly how you define the term stakeholder, and then come back to the video and we'll carry on. So hopefully that wasn't too difficult. Hopefully you found that useful to get down your thoughts on paper. Maybe you already realized what they were. Maybe you had to think quite carefully. But we'll now move on to think about how the term stakeholder is defined in the literature and by systematic review experts. So Freeman describes a stakeholder as any group or individual who's affected by or can affect the achievement of an organization's objectives. Here, the critical things for me are that it's either a group or an individual, that group or individual might be affected by an organization's objectives or have the ability themselves to affect the organization's achievement of their objectives. So quite a few nuanced statements within that one definition. This is one example of a group of stakeholders, both broader groups and then slightly more narrow and focused groups within one specific example, a case study of a biological reserve in Brazil. And now this is being produced by researchers, this schematic, but it might be produced quite differently by some of the different groups, whether it's produced by traditional communities or by people working in the reserve or by industry. So it's a very complex issue and it might be broken down in different ways, but this is just to give an example of some of the complexity in thinking about who stakeholders are in a particular topic. So as part of a project that we conducted a few years ago, we did a qualitative survey of experienced systematic reviewers to ask them how they defined the term stakeholder. And we were specifically asking in reference to systematic reviews. One person described it as people who are either affected by the issue or those who may be able to influence the issue, includes local people, e.g. producers, NGOs, and governments. Someone else said that it's anyone with an interest in a particular issue or anyone likely to be affected by an issue or a decision. It includes poor people and researchers and research experts, systematic review methodology experts in particular. Another person said that it's people that have an interest in the subject matter, includes researchers and experts, those generating evidence and the end users of evidence, also includes subjects of conservation and development projects. Another person said that a stakeholder is a person or representative of an organization that's affected by an activity that is being reviewed in one way or another, and that includes scientists. Another said it's those who have a stake in the question, e.g. policymakers, academics, educators, NGOs. And someone else said it's someone who has a stake in the findings. The issues have real meaning in their lives, someone affected by the review findings. And someone else said, those in one way or another that use the information from a systematic review, mainly those in decision-making, e.g. ministries, agencies, on all levels, local, national, and international, and include scientists. So you can see there's quite a lot of diversity there. Having conducted that research, we actually came up with a conceptual model of stakeholders. We realized that people's definitions were very complex, that they covered several different aspects. And we, as a group, very carefully broke this down into three main sections in our conceptual model. So we thought that there are, first of all, actors who might be more traditionally what people think of as stakeholder groups. That can include advocacy groups, businesses, citizens, decision enforcers, decision makers, publishers, research funders, and researchers. Those actors then perform certain roles within a research perspective, particularly with respect to systematic reviews. They could be editors or peer reviewers. They could be endorsers. They could be evidence holders, funders, publishers, communicators, question askers, reviewers, scope influencers, service providers, service users, or users of the review. Then those actors performing those roles might perform certain actions, including suggesting sources of literature, submitting articles, undertaking the review, endorsing the review, facilitating access to the review, reading the review, sharing the review, integrating findings into decisions, setting the review's methodological standards, providing funding and/or in-kind contributions, and sharing knowledge and experience for the scope and the context of the review. And certain actors can perform multiple roles, and within each role, they can perform multiple actions. And so by breaking it down into these three groups, you can see that by thinking about stakeholders as people, we might ignore some of the nuance of how they perform multiple roles and might have multiple actions within each of those roles. And some of those actions and roles might contradict with one another in terms of how we think they might be influenced by the review or influence the review. So by breaking it down, more than just saying who those people are, we might get a better idea of how they're going to be affecting or interacting with the review and its findings. So for example, we might have a concerned citizen who uses the review on the impacts of plastics on marine biota to integrate the review findings into their decision-making about whether to purchase plastic water bottles or not. That's quite basic, but then we might have a more complex example where, for example, research councils fund a review on the efficacy of crayfish conservation. They provide money for the review, but they also integrate the findings of evidence gaps into their decisions about where they fund primary research. If you want to know more about how we went about producing this conceptual model, then check out the reference below our framework for stakeholder engagement. That will be on your reading list anyway. So why is it useful to have a broad definition like this? Well, in one way, systematic reviews that are public goods, so they're published in the public domain, they are aiming at being general enough to be applicable in multiple different contexts and not just for one specific person who wanted that review in the first place. So for these systematic reviews that are public goods as opposed to being private goods that aren't published more widely, we don't just have our typical end users. We won't just be taking that review to the people who asked for it. There'll be lots of other people who end up using the review. So having a broader definition and trying to predict who those users might be that aren't our particular commissioner is really useful for us to understand the kind of outputs that people are looking for and messages that people want. By having a broader definition, it also means that we're hopefully less likely to exclude marginalized groups, particularly groups who've been historically excluded. As I said before, actors can have multiple roles and perform multiple actions, and by thinking more broadly, particularly using a conceptual model like the one I just showed, we can think about how actors might behave in ways that we're not particularly prepared for. And related to that, we can identify and mitigate risks of unforeseen bias. So by thinking more broadly and trying to think about who's going to be engaging with our review and how, we might be able to identify some areas, for example, conflict of interest in researchers, where we might want to put some things in place to prevent undue influence on our review. And related to that, it means that we're able to plan our review better, that we have more resilience to both undue influence, but we're also able to plan our resources better and predict where we might need to spend more time. And in general, it helps us to focus less on the who and more on the how of engagement works. And that's really where there's the nuance. We're not assuming that all people with a certain label, all people with a certain job title or working for a certain organization work in the same way. They very rarely do. And so we're able to think a bit more diversely about how they're going to be engaging with our work, and then predict ways that might maximize engagement. There are some situations when we might not want to call stakeholders. We might want to talk about stakeholder engagement more broadly, referring to stakeholder, but then when it comes to actually speaking to our stakeholders, we might want to avoid that term. And that's because the term stakeholder hides a lot of detail. It lumps lots of groups together, and some people might have a bit of a problem with that. But it also often disguises that need for tailoring our engagement to specific actors performing specific roles with likely actions. It also might be that historically, stakeholder engagement has been fairly tokenistic. And what that means is that people have engaged with stakeholders just to tick a box, and that engagement has not been effective. It may not have had enough resources, and it might have been quite ineffectual, or may even have caused damage. So the term stakeholder or stakeholder engagement might be associated with negative connotations for some of our end users. And there are also some situations where the term stakeholder is contentious. And one example is with the Sami people, who are an indigenous people in Scandinavia, who typically object to the term stakeholder. And that's because it's been used in financial and rights perspectives related to land ownership. And the Sami historically reject the idea of owning land. Instead, they curate the land. And so the term stakeholder typically has excluded them historically from discussions around land use change and planning permission and land rights. So it's better to talk more generally, as I say, about stakeholder engagement when we're planning and in our methods, but then really be specific. Who exactly are we talking about? How are they engaging and why? And how are we going to be interacting with them? So we're now going to come back to you. Think in this next practical exercise about whether a broader definition would work for you. So having seen this presentation, do you think perhaps your definition has changed? Maybe it hasn't. Maybe you are very happy with your definition. Maybe you already used a broad definition of stakeholder. But take some time and go back to your first submission in the discussion board and think about whether your definition has changed. Who might you have missed in this definition? Write a short paragraph about whether you think anything has changed, whether you agree with the conclusions from our study on that conceptual model, and think about what the benefits or disadvantages are of having a broad definition. Maybe there are some problems that you can see with having a broad definition. And just write a short paragraph about that. Check up on what other people have written, and we'll be engaging with your answers and writing to you about some of the things that you've described as well. Thanks very much.